Hello, this is Dr. Busson here. I wanted to thank everybody for all the good work so far this semester and for your work on the midterm. We're moving forward now to the next period, which is the bebop period. I'm going to start with a series of investigative questions concerning bebop: when, where, who, and for who. So when we talk of when, it's the time frame from 1945 to 1950, where this takes place starting in New York City. Who was involved as far as the musicians? These were black musicians that were pretty exhausted from being on the road, and they left the big bands for the jam session venue. And who was it aimed for, this bebop music? It was a subcultural art aimed at a specialized audience of jazz aficionados or jazz enthusiasts. So kind of wasn't as broad of an audience as the swing era. Defining bebop. Start clarifying what makes the style. So bebop can be viewed as a deliberate break from jazz as a popular dance music, and is kind of transformed into a music that is more isolated, non-danceable. It's played by smaller combos to a small audience in a virtuosic style. By virtuosic, meaning highly skilled players. There are two ways that we could view the evolution of bebop music. The first one is that bebop was revolutionary, something apart from the jazz that preceded it. That's a vision. The second is that bebop is evolutionary, part of the jazz tradition that made it into an art music. Now, that means it did change, but it was still built upon a tradition of the swing era. The following shows the evolutionary approach. Okay, Bebop and Jam Sessions. Swing musicians worked in the evening and continued to play after hours at what we call jam sessions. These after-hour jams were relaxing on one hand, in the fact that they were informal, but they were work-like in how competitive they were with their fellow musicians. The musicians that were into the style, they kept the inexperienced players off the bandstand by playing tunes in ridiculously fast tempos and in hard keys. So if they get somebody that they think is not quite up to the level that they would like, they would kind of work them over and play it real fast, maybe name a key that's not traditionally the key of the tune. Bebop musicians were always testing and experimenting with fast tempos and complicated harmonies and rhythms. They were always trying to explore. Now, in New York, there's a place called Minton's Playhouse, was famous for these after-hour jam sessions. Charlie Parker and other beboppers played at Minton's Playhouse in Manhattan. There was an Adventurous Challenge was the name of the game. This drummer, Kenny Clarke, he changed the drumming style while playing at the fast tempos with Teddy Hill's band in the 1930s. So the tempos were too fast for Clarke to play every beat on the bass drum, which was more the tradition in the swing era. Thus, he adapted the feel by keeping the beat on the ride cymbal and producing a lighter, more flexible way to keep time. And then he would use the bass drum for fills. Now, this is kind of interesting, is the turn of events here. The band leader, Teddy Hill, and some of the other musicians, they didn't like Clarke's new way of playing and keeping time on the drums for the new style. And so they thought the beat was too broken up, so they fired Clarke, Kenny Clarke, in 1940. Now, the poetic justice is, when Teddy Hill's band broke up soon after, the owner of the club, Minton, he offered Kenny Clarke the job of running the music at the Playhouse. So the guy that got fired from the band on previous employment, he was all of a sudden in charge of things. So if you were one of those people that didn't like the way he played and got him fired from the band, you probably weren't going to be in Minton's Playhouse with Kenny Clarke in charge, as you can imagine. Okay, Minton realized that Clarke's style of playing would be really good for those jam sessions. Clarke's unexpected bass drum accents came to be known as dropping bombs. And we will have some examples for you to listen to in the course shell just below this YouTube video that I'm narrating. Okay, specifics about the bebop style. Soloists played unpredictable melodies, and this was inspired by Lester Young, if you remember him from the swing era. Very important sax player, inspired a lot of people, including Billie Holiday. So phrases often ended with a couple of eighth notes, and that's where they nicknamed the name bebop. So if you had those last two notes, those would be bebop. And then pianists are inspired by Basie. They started doing what's called the comp, and that's putting accompaniment chords in unpredictable places that complemented the drum part. So in the swing era, they had more of what's called a 4-on-the-floor sound, which is like Count Basie's band would have a thing that sounded kind of like this, Freddie Green. Real steady. When you're comping, it's more like this. Much more sparse. Okay, and then the bass line was still a constant thing. As far as being very steady walking bass lines, they were the main timekeepers. Going ahead, nobody plays those changes. So they changed up the way the chords were played quite a bit. Bebop's characterized by dissonant harmonies, and it was foreshadowed by some of the swing musicians, naming three: Art Tatum, Duke Ellington, those are a couple of piano players, and the sax player Coleman Hawkins. They kind of foretold of this new harmony that was a part of bebop. There's always people that are ahead of their time in any art form. The challenge was how to share these new harmonies so that other musicians could use them. You don't want to keep it a secret, right? Dizzy Gillespie, he was key in getting younger people involved in the new style. So Dizzy Gillespie offered instruction and guidance to young players interested in the new style. On the road, racial and economic forces were driving African American musicians away from swing music. The life was just too hard. During the swing era, black musicians, they couldn't get work like the white musicians. So racial and economic forces were driving musicians out of swing. Non-musical forces set the stage for the revolutionary philosophy of bebop. Most black bands were forced onto the road, traveling on buses and touring in the Jim Crow South, where they were subjected to discriminatory practices. Couldn't ride in the same part of the bus, had to be in the back of the bus, couldn't drink out of the same drinking fountains, couldn't eat in certain restaurants, couldn't stay in certain hotels, on and on. On the road continued. These musicians, black musicians, they became bitter and exhausted. And so eventually they left the big bands for the jam sessions. So bebop provided a site where they could go and explore their music. By the early 1940s, a new jazz was in place. All that was needed was a new kind of virtuoso. Okay, so that virtuoso, one of them is Charlie Parker. Lived from 1920 to 1955. If you do the math, that's only 35 years. That's a pretty short lifespan. Parker, or nickname Bird, is considered the best, well, heck, the greatest alto saxophonist in jazz history in a lot of people's book. He grew up in Kansas City, received his nickname after he provided a Yardbird dinner to his bandmates during a trip to a gig. A Yardbird dinner, that's a dinner in the form of a run-over chicken. But the name Bird also resonates with the melodic beauty applied to Parker's style. And I think that's more the way the nickname really stuck. Initially, Parker did not show a great gift for music, and he was at times humiliated at jam sessions in Kansas City. So this spurred him to practice intensely for a summer in the Ozarks. His model was Lester Young, and he memorized a number of his solos. Then he returned to Kansas City, and he was described as playing like Lester Young, only twice as fast. So this kind of romantic story about a musician who's humiliated and then goes off and works hard on his craft and then returns, that's the one that you may have heard with Robert Johnson, the blues player. Well, here it is again with Charlie Parker. His solo playing was both bluesy and modern, so it's a combination. And he was eventually hired to play in Kansas City big band Jay Machan. This is where it gets a little sad. Here it says, after a car accident, he started using alcohol, pills, and morphine to deal with the pain, and eventually moved on to heroin. In New York, he moved to New York, and he had a readily available supply of heroin, but there was also the jam sessions to play. And through the jam sessions, he found a network of musicians that shared his approach to advanced music. And one important musician was Dizzy Gillespie.